I've been going to the north of Canada called Yukon for the last 20 years on a regular basis, working for Kaska Dena. Dena means the people. Kaska is a particular nation of the people, Kaska Dena, who are around the southeast part of the Yukon. The Yukon is a small town the size of France. You know, and you Australians get that. You know what I mean? But very few people in very few other countries actually get what that distance, what the relative small groups of people in vast spaces actually means for life and for how you address violence. Anne has been, we've had two really extraordinary projects in the last few years. In the Yukon, there was a crisis of policing. What happened was that two RCMP, that's Royal Canadian Mounted Police, they're the police force in the Yukon, and in most of Canada. We have urban police forces, but we have the RCMP covers most of Canada. There were two RCMP officers who were accused of raping a nurse. They were eventually acquitted, and however, the way the judge talked about the nurse was immensely problematic, talking about this woman who had moved to the town that day and got really, really drunk accidentally, sort of, and the judge described her as rolling around erotically on the medicine ball in front of the police. You know, so you had this incredibly problematic judicial response. You had police in a very small community charged with raping a nurse, which you will know just sent shockwaves through the entire community. At the same time, there was an Indigenous man called Raymond Silverfox who died in custody, police custody. At the same time, there was a woman who had been kidnapped by two Indigenous men and tied up in a cabin and repeatedly raped over a period of days while a captive. When she went to court in that 2-week period, the defense for the two accused men asked the judge for permission to ask her about her sexual history. And the judge agreed. And so the woman stood up and said, "You know what, Your Honor? Fuck you." And he said, "I find you in contempt." And she said, "Fuck you." And she tried to walk out and eventually got away, but the men, of course, were not charged. But all this happened in 2 weeks in an area where there's 35,000 people the size of France, so you can imagine. And so the police got in touch with Anne and said, "We have a problem, would you help us?" And because she's a person of sort of immense credibility in the Yukon. And she said, "Well, if you have a little bit of seed money, I'll see if I can transform that I'll apply for more funding from the state, federal government," which she did, and she got this money. So we had a project called Together for Justice, where Indigenous women, using Kathy Richardson and myself as facilitators, met with the entire command structure of the RCMP in the Yukon for 2 years, 4 days every 2 months for 2 years. And Kathy and I agreed to do it only if the entire command structure attended, no exceptions, blackberries turned off. And they agreed. So we had procedures where we interviewed young police officers as Indigenous women, talking about their experiences of police. We interviewed Indigenous women as police officers. You know, we had elders, Indigenous elders, sitting around with police coats on, because in the beginning of that process, I couldn't even talk about ice hockey. And in Canada, if you can't talk about ice hockey, that's a problem. I couldn't talk about ice hockey with any of the police officers. They would not talk to me. They were so terrified that they were going to be vilified. And you can understand that, right, in that kind of a context. So Anne, being the wise person she is, figured out what to do. So the next meeting we had, she invited elders. So we had 15 Kaska elders descend upon the gathering. And they very strategically sat around the room. And pretty soon, you had, they're talking to the police officer. "Oh, and where are you from, son?" So you have these young kind of white kids talking with these elders, and they were just overwhelmed by the kindness and the dignity. And pretty soon they're getting up and getting the elders tea. So it just changed the whole thing, because you really know in that context, elders create safety. Elders create safety and dignity, right? And the women feel safe when the men drum. So it's all tied into culture. That project has now been recognized by the United Nations as a model project for improving police responses. And so throughout that project, we engaged the police in critical analysis of language, understanding victim resistance, a lot of things I'll share with you here.